good whatever time of day it is that you happen to be listening to this. This is for College Comp. It is Compare Contrast, which we do second out of our purposes. Now, the reason we do it this early isn't because it's complicated or it isn't because it's easy. We do it because it has a specific structure to it, and it teaches us how to do a few things which are very useful as writers. Part of Compare Contrast is that we're going to be working with transitions and learning how a transition can be used to coordinate a larger essay. So just like we use argumentation first because it's kind of the spine for everything, we use Compare Contrast because it lays out a pattern to turn that spine into a full skeleton. Now, at its most simple, compare contrast is this. Comparison is when you show how two or more things are similar. My dog has a tail, my cat has a tail, my mouse has a tail, they have tails, they are similar. Contrast, we look at ways in which things are different. This is pretty elementary, right? I do not have a tail, my dog has a tail, my mouse used to have a tail, but thresher accident, you know. So, in compare contrast as a process, the two are used together to fuse into one unique style. Now, there are many ways to do it. There's a specific type of compare contrast called a comparison through analogy, and this is a little bit tricky, but we actually do it quite a lot. This is when you explain one thing by comparing it to a second, much more familiar thing. For example, out of the textbook, they use analogy to shed light on the nature of contemporary high schools by comparing it to a shopping mall. Dated analogy, I know, but still. Their argument states if Americans want to understand their high schools at work, they should imagine them as shopping malls. Secondary education is another consumption experience in an abundant society. So by taking something we know, when, for example, your average 40-year-old doesn't know a whole lot about what high school is like, they do know what a shopping mall looks like, although not anymore. Anyway. Now, there are many ways to identify what a compare-contrast is, as well as many ways to identify when you should use compare-contrast as your assignment. Much like any form of writing, you're not going to sit down and say to yourself, hey, I think I'm going to write a compare-contrast essay today, because you're not boring, for starters. Instead, you're often given assignments, and based upon the assignment, they might suggest compare-contrast, or you'll decide that compare-contrast best suits what you need to do to answer that question or address that assignment. Depending on how things are explained or how things are presented to you, that might be something to do. For example, when a question has keywords such as compare and contrast, similarities and differences, relative merits, advantages, disadvantages, things like that, they kind of indicate that you should use compare-contrast. For another way to look at it would be, what is greater or less? The book uses who is the greater of the two Adams, John or Samuel, who had the most important influence on the timing and the course of the American Revolution, or which was better, George Bush I or George Bush II, Electric Boogaloo. The word greater is enough to suggest a contrast that needs to be made within your essay. Now, even when your assignment isn't worded to suggest compare-contrast, your purpose might point to that pattern of development. For example, when it asks you to evaluate something, that means you're looking for uses of compare and contrast. If you're a student in a management course and you're asked to evaluate healthcare systems, the easiest way to do it is to begin by researching the standards that experts might use in their evaluations. You then compare each system's performance with the standards and you contrast the systems and so on. If you're talking about let's go back to that old chestnut of the death penalty. If you're writing an argumentative essay about the death penalty, maybe one thing you could do would be to consider how the death penalty is handled in other successful cities or countries or nations throughout history. Now, once you've started to decide whether or not you're going to do compare-contrast, you have to come up with a basis for comparison. If you don't have a basis for comparison, compare-contrast is not your boy. That is, the two things have to have enough in common to justify the comparison. For example, cats, dogs, they're very different, but they do have several significant elements. They're mammals, they make good pets, they're intelligent, they could be trained to fetch, they can be trained to not poo everywhere all over your house. Without those shared elements, there's no basis for analysis and there's nothing important to discuss. It's harder to compare, say, dogs and field mice. They are mammals, yeah, but that's boring. What else can we say? So when you're thinking about compare contrast, think about not only could I say something about it, could I say that they're mammals and be boring? Is there enough that I could say about them? Is there enough that I could say about them that would be interesting? What might be provocative to my reader? Because again, as writers, your goal is to be interesting. There's no point in writing something if it's boring for the reader. If you try to draw an analogy between bees and SUVs or humans and golf clubs, I mean, sure, you could make a few points, but nothing really worth making. A couple years ago, a student wrote about Donald Trump compared to Shrek the Ogre, and that was interesting because she came up with a few provocative points for comparison. It was meant to be funny. Anyway, when the subjects are similar enough, a contrast might be worth writing about. If they're really similar, then you start thinking about how can I separate the two? How is one different from another? Think about school versus prison. Are they similar? Are they different? What can we do about that in terms of a compare-contrast essay? If the two subjects aren't very much alike, then maybe look at ways in which you can talk about the similarities. So, structure. Structure is an interesting thing to identify within compare-contrast. And the first way to identify structure when you're trying to figure out what your points are for your discussion are to decide, am I going to talk about subject by subject, or am I going to talk about point by point? Now, if you're going to do subject by subject, then you essentially are going to write an entirely separate essay about each subject, but you discuss the same points for each subject, arranging the points in a logical order. And it's usually in the significance of the thesis. You're looking for a rolling sort of structure. If I were to compare dogs to cats on a subject by subject basis, I would talk about dogs first and then cats second, or cats first and dogs second, whichever you want to do. My 3 points within each separate essay would be the same, but the subjects would be different. Now, if you're writing a shorter essay, let's say a two body paragraph essay, you have an introduction, 2 body paragraphs, and a conclusion, you would devote an entire paragraph separately to a dog and an entire paragraph separately to a cat, making the same points as you go. So if we want to look at it in a interesting way, we can think about it like this. A thesis for a subject by subject essay would be, despite the fact that television and radio are distinctly different media, they use similar strategies to appeal to their audience. In a subject by subject essay, I decided I want to start with TV. So, television, point 1, I'm going to talk about how strategies are used to appeal to men. Point 2, how are the strategies used to appeal to women? Point 3, how are strategies used to appeal to children? And in my conclusion, of course, I go back and I restate my thesis and I review my key points and I talk about in what way does that prove what I'm talking about. In a point-by-point comparison, I go back and forth. I don't stick to just dogs or just cats or just television and just radio. I make a point about one subject and then I follow it up with a comparable point about the other. And this alternating pattern continues back and forth until all the points have been made. So here's an example. Melville's Moby Dick and London's Seawolf. They're both about the sea. London, however, is considered a writer from the realism period, whereas Melville is considered much more of a romantic author. So as a result, even though they're both about the sea, their minor characters, their major characters, and their themes are different, and the themes of Moby Dick establish a greater complexity. If I'm doing it like subject by subject, I say the Seawolf, and then book 2 is Moby Dick. Major characters, the Seawolf, Moby Dick. Themes, the Seawolf, and then Moby Dick. Now, point by point is useful for longer essays, which we're going to be getting into more later. If you're starting to write those 3,000-word, 10-page essays, you're looking at many different points. When you're dealing with something of that size, it's not just that old chestnut of introduction. Body paragraph 1 is point 1, body paragraph 2 is point 2, body paragraph 3 is point 3. A larger essay is bigger. You might still have 3 claims driving it, but you're going to have many points that you're making. And if you only have 1 or 2 points of comparison, a subject by subject organization is fine, but otherwise, for a larger essay, point by point is great. transitions are why compare-contrast are so interesting as a purpose. And there's a full list on page 389 that I highly recommend you look at because I am expecting you to know it. The short answer is, for comparison, you say things like comparison, in comparison, likewise, similarly, that sort of thing. Contrast, you would say conversely, despite, even though, that sort of stuff. Those are transitional phrases. In addition to this, we have something called the transitional paragraph. The transitional paragraph is not just for compare-contrast. It is useful everywhere you go, no matter what you do, and you are going to be writing a lot of transitional paragraphs. Not just in this class, but just in general. Once you start getting to something in the nature of 2,500 to 3,000 words or more, transitional paragraphs are excellent because that way you don't lose your way. If you're arguing for the death penalty in a 5-paragraph essay, you just need a transitional phrase. In comparison, Finland is great. By contrast, Singapore canes people. However, with a transitional paragraph in a longer essay, you start to deal with much more in-depth analyses of what's going on. Perhaps you're doing a death penalty essay and you're going to spend your first point talking about the death penalty in the United States, the history of the death penalty in the United States, and the current legislation on the death penalty in the United States. And then from there, you make a transition to, for example, Finland and Singapore. And then those transition paragraphs become a way for you to orient yourself, but also your reader. I like to think about transition paragraphs as miniature conclusions. Because in the end, a large essay is no different than a small essay. You have an introduction, you have a body, and you have a conclusion. However, just like with a snowflake or a mountain, if you've ever looked at a snowflake or a mountain under a microscope, you'll notice that they're the same structure when they're small as they are when they're big. A longer essay is the same thing. You still have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, but within that body, you also have miniature introductions, you have miniature bodies, you have miniature conclusions, all connected together by claims and grounds and warrants. And in class, when we're talking about this, I'll outline one for you to kind of show you how it fits together. Those transitional paragraphs become conclusions. If I am saying the death penalty should be abolished because of unfair legislation, minority targeting, and too many wrongful convictions, I will write an entire essay about wrongful convictions. I will write an entire essay about problem legislation, and they will be connected together with miniature conclusions that talk about why that one claim and those little pieces within prove it. And I'm going to refer to those throughout the classes as subclaims. So pay close attention in class on Wednesday as we're talking about this, or whatever day we do this on, I guess. Why do I say Wednesday? Anyway, the structure of a longer essay seems complicated, but when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it works fine. And the reason it works fine is because of a transitional paragraph, where you as a writer, and you can let your reader pause and think about what was said, as well as time for you to hammer home why that section is worth talking about. So, just like the argumentation chapter, and just like every other purpose chapter, we have pieces, segments. On page 389, we have ways to revise a compare-contrast essay. And there's a nice checklist, again, on page 54 of your book. But pay really close attention to the items in this checklist that's on page 389 and 390. They apply specifically to compare-contrast essays. They deal with things like, does your assignment call for compare-contrast? Would you be better off talking about cause-effect or definition? What basis for comparison might exist between your two subjects? So when you're doing peer review and you're looking at your own work, you can think about, does this basis for comparison warrant compare-contrast? Does the essay have a thesis, which is a compare-contrast thesis? Do I discuss the same points? All that good stuff. There's also a grammar and context section, and this grammar and context section uses parallelism, which you probably haven't heard much about. But it is useful, and I do want you to look at it, but don't stress it, because there is a grammar packet coming which does deal heavily with parallelism. The short answer is when you're dealing with multiple topics at once, and you want to talk about both of them in the same section. There is a student writer section in this chapter as well, but there are two, because it's two different types of compare-contrast essays. The first type is subject by subject on page 391. The subject by subject essay was written by an author named Mark Cothern, and it's a subject by subject comparison where the instructor asks students to write an essay comparing two educational experiences. So what he does is he discusses discrimination in multiple educational experiences. On another essay, the point-by-point comparison example on page 397 deals with somebody named Maria Texan, who does a point-by-point comparison comparing two websites about a health issue to determine which is the most reliable source. Pay close attention to them. I recommend reading them. Look at how they're ordered out because they're very useful to you. And also pay close attention to the post-reading stuff where they lay out exactly what the points are that are being used and how transitions are used. They're useful, trust me.